Welcome back, everyone, to the Arthashastra series. This is our 6th installment, believe it or not.
Time flies when you're delving into ancient statecraft.
It really does. Today, we're embarking on a deep dive into something absolutely crucial for any state. Then or now, really. We're talking about the civil service.
Exactly. As Kautilya envisioned it in the Arthashastra, it's foundational.
So, our mission today for you listening is to really unpack this. Kautilya's whole system, how he thought you should recruit people, manage them.
Oversee them. I mean, these were the people running the day-to-day operations of a massive empire. It wasn't simple stuff.
Not at all. And we want to get into not just what the rules were, but sort of the why behind them. Because honestly, some of it feels surprisingly modern.
It really does. The insights are, well, quite relevant, even today.
Okay, so the sources we've got for this deep dive, they really get into the nitty-gritty, don't they?
Oh, yeah. We're talking recruitment details, specific job duties, financial oversight, which is huge, ethical rules.
And even, like, the psychology Kautilya seemed to be using. It's fascinating stuff.
Definitely.
All right, let's dive in. Why put so much emphasis on this? Why was a well-oiled civil service so important for Kautilya?
Well, you have to understand the context. Governing a huge, diverse empire, it's incredibly complex. Kautilya saw the bureaucracy as more than just order takers.
Right.
He saw it as the state's circulatory system, essential for information to flow, for policies to actually happen on the ground, and just for holding everything together.
So it wasn't just about having smart ideas at the top.
Not at all. Kautilya was very clear. Even the best policies, the wisest decrees, they'd just fall flat without a solid structure for execution. For him, administration was almost like, well, engineering. It needed careful design, precision. You know, like a great business plan needs a team to actually make it work.
That makes total sense.
Yeah.
The best blueprint is useless without skilled builders.
Okay, one thing that jumped out was the level of detail in job descriptions. That feels ahead of its time, doesn't it? It really was a remarkable innovation, actually, and a key lesson, I think. Kautilya insisted on precise job descriptions for everyone.
Like from the lowest tax collector right up to the city boss.
Exactly. And these weren't just vague outlines. They had expected outcomes, how performance would be judged, and crucially, the consequences for not measuring up.
Wow. So no wiggle room to say, that wasn't really my job.
Pretty much. The goal was total functional clarity, eliminate ambiguity, eliminate overlap, which, let's be honest, is something modern systems sometimes struggle with, right?
Oh, definitely. Roles can get blurry.
Yeah. So Kautilya's principle seems to be name it, define it, measure it. Simple but powerful.
And it wasn't just defining roles, was it? There was this huge emphasis on oversight, too, making sure people did what they were supposed to. How did that work?
Oversight was absolutely a cornerstone, non-negotiable. He built in layers of monitoring, audits, regular checks.
Even counterintelligence within the administration.
Yes, which sounds maybe a bit much to us now, perhaps?
Well, yeah, it sounds like it could slow everything down. Was his approach different?
That's a great point. And here's a key difference. Unlike some modern systems where checks can cause delays, Kautilya's oversight was meant to be fluid, integrated.
How so?
Well, monitoring wasn't just after the fact. It happened in parallel with the work.
Okay.
So you had spies giving real-time reports on potential issues. You had independent record keepers just focused on financial transparency.
Right.
And then there was the frequent rotation of officials. We'll come back to that, which also stopped anyone getting too powerful in one spot. It was this interesting balance between agility and accountability.
It's almost like he didn't just trust people inherently.
Right.
He designed a system to make it harder to do the wrong thing.
That's a perfect way to put it. Which leads us straight into the ethics, doesn't it?
It does. It sounds like he had a pretty, well, realistic view of human nature. Maybe even a bit cynical.
He certainly did. And that's maybe a vital lesson for anyone designing systems, you know? Kautilya was realistic. He understood human tendencies. And that shaped his whole approach to ethics in the civil service. He didn't rely on idealism, on expecting everyone to just be good.
So what did he do instead?
He designed a system that actively incentivized ethical behavior and discouraged the opposite, using very practical, very clear mechanisms.
Like what? Can you give some examples?
Sure. So things like salary structures designed specifically to reduce the temptation for bribery, clear consequences for corruption, scaled by how bad the offense was.
Right.
And on the other side, ways to recognize and reward really good service, integrity,
Yeah.
positive reinforcement.
So ethics weren't just hoped for, they were sort of enabled by the system.
Exactly. Enabled by transparency, by motivation, and by clear, consistent consequences. That was the thinking.
Okay, so a well-paid, well-watched, ethically motivated civil service. It sounds like efficiency was also a massive goal here.
Absolute massive. For Kautilya, efficiency wasn't just, good management practice. It was a strategic asset, a core strength of the state.
How did that translate into tangible benefits?
Well, think about it practically. Efficient tax collection. That means a full treasury. Resources for defense, infrastructure, everything.
Makes sense.
Efficient law and order. That means internal stability, a predictable environment for trade, for life, and the ability to mobilize resources quickly in a crisis war, famine, whatever, that was crucial for survival. Kautilya basically saw an efficient bureaucracy as the engine driving the state's sovereignty, its ability to act.
It's really striking how relevant these core ideas still feel. Another thing that stood out was the emphasis on data. Record keeping. It sounds incredibly modern.
It is remarkably prescient, isn't it? Long before we started talking about data-driven everything, Kautilya institutionalized regular record-keeping, performance metrics.
So officials had to keep logs.
Yeah.
Reports.
Oh, yes. Daily activity logs, reports on tax collections, spending, even population shifts in their area. And this is key. They had to justify any discrepancies.
Wow, you couldn't just fudge the numbers.
You certainly couldn't get away with it easily. Penalties for failing to justify discrepancies were significant.
And he even had ways to check if the data was accurate.
Yeah.
How did he stop people just making things up?
He did. He insisted on cross-verifying information from multiple independent sources.
Like early data triangulation.
Exactly. It was a basic but effective way to ensure the information the government relied on was actually reliable. Pretty sophisticated for the time.
Definitely. Now, given the sheer size and diversity of the empire, how did he make sure these regulations were adaptable, not just rigid rules applied everywhere?
That's a really important question, and it touches on his genius, perhaps. The regulations weren't meant to be set in stone. They were designed with adaptability built in.
How so? What were the mechanisms for adapting?
Several things. One was strategically reassigning officials based on their performance and the needs of different regions.
Okay.
He also suggested reforming salary scales based on the state's finances and local economic conditions.
Right, practical.
And crucially, amending policies based on feedback from the people and how things were actually working out locally. He saw governance as a living process, not a static rule book.
So the system could flex without breaking.
Precisely. It was designed to absorb change, adapt to different situations without losing its core principles of accountability and efficiency.
It really makes you think about how we design large organizations today. It seems Kautilya was thinking bigger than just day-to-day management. He was building an enduring system.
Absolutely. His whole approach wasn't just about controlling bad behavior. It was about proactively designing a system where corruption was difficult and being ethical was, the easier path.
That proactive, preventative approach sounds very modern.
It is. And a key part of that design was the clear hierarchy, wasn't it? Defined roles, responsibilities.
Right. You mentioned the detailed job descriptions earlier.
Exactly. An intricate hierarchy. Every position had defined duties, limits on authority, clear reporting channels, up and down.
And everything documented? Checked.
Meticulously documented. Subject to cross-verification. Open to independent inspection. These are basically early checks and balances, deeply embedded in the system.
So the philosophy was almost trust the system, not just the individual.
I think that's a fair summary. No single person should have unchecked power, and the system shouldn't depend only on individual virtue. The structure itself had to resist corruption and inefficiency.
Okay. Now, another interesting point was this idea of institutional memory combined with rotating officials. Seems almost contradictory.
It does at first glance, but it was quite strategic. The rotation moving officials between posts periodically was designed to prevent stagnation.
Prevent people getting too comfortable. Developing fiefdoms.
Exactly. Prevent favoritism, undue influence, stop people getting too entrenched.
Okay, that makes sense. But what about losing experience when people move?
That's where institutional memory comes in. Kautilya valued that collective knowledge, but he didn't want it only in the heads of individuals who might leave.
So it needed to be in the system itself.
Yes. In well-kept records, standardized procedures, things new officials could access and learn from. It's what we'd now call administrative resilience. The system keeps functioning even as people change.
Building knowledge that outlasts any one person. Got it. Now, the use of spies to monitor officials. That's bound to raise eyebrows today, ethically speaking. What was the thinking there?
It's definitely one of the more debated aspects, judged by modern standards. But Kautilya's aim was primarily preventive deterrence.
Deterrence. How?
He understood psychology. The perception of being watched can be a powerful influence on behavior, maybe even more than direct authority sometimes.
The invisible eye effect.
Precisely. It's like an ancient surveillance audit. The idea was to keep officials mindful of their duties, their ethics, the potential consequences, even if they weren't being directly supervised at that exact moment.
So it wasn't necessarily about catching every single wrongdoing.
Not exclusively. It was more about creating a climate, a pervasive sense that actions could be scrutinized.
A fascinating, if slightly unsettling, approach. Shifting gears a bit, integrity wasn't just a moral good for Kautilya, it was strategic, right?
Absolutely crucial point. Honesty, loyalty, competence. These weren't optional extras for him. They were essential strategic assets for the state's stability and prosperity.
Why strategic?
Well, his logic was pretty clear. An ethical civil service leads to a more predictable, reliable government.
Okay.
And a predictable government builds trust with its own people and earns respect from other states, from allies. It has very tangible benefits.
Beyond just doing the right thing.
Exactly. He even warned about the danger of too much power concentrating in the hands of even seemingly trustworthy officials. They could become rival power centers, even threaten the ruler.
So maintaining ethics wasn't just about stopping petty theft, it was about safeguarding sovereignty.
Fundamentally, yes. Safeguarding the unity and stability of the entire state.
That really puts it in a different light. So how did he ensure this ethical framework was actually followed? How were people held accountable?
He put a huge emphasis on tracking performance. You couldn't just blend in. Good or bad, your performance was noted.
Okay.
There was a system for recognizing excellence, monetary rewards, land grants, promotions, real incentives.
And for the flip side, underperformance or ethical breaches.
A clear, structured system of penalties, fines for minor things, imprisonment for more serious issues, even capital punishment in extreme cases of corruption or betrayal.
Sounds harsh.
It could be. But the key was predictability. Everyone knew the rules, knew the stakes. Kautilya believed this predictability was vital for fostering an ethical culture.
So clear expectations, consistent consequences, trying to build trust in the system itself.
Absolutely. For citizens, it meant expecting fairness when dealing with the state. For officials, it meant the rules weren't arbitrary, rewards were linked to contribution and ethics, and duty was both a job and a moral commitment. This predictability, he thought, was the bedrock of trust in governance.
It's amazing how these challenges echo today. His insights into the psychology of power seem especially timeless.
They really are. Kautilya was a sharp observer of human nature. He knew that people with authority, access to resources, well, they face temptations. Greed, ambition, entitlement.
That famous quote about tasting honey.
Exactly. Impossible not to taste honey on the tip of the tongue. Impossible for one dealing with government funds not to taste the king's wealth. It perfectly captures his understanding of that human tendency.
So he wasn't naive about corruption.
Not at all. He didn't assume everyone would be inherently virtuous, so he built a regulatory framework that accounted for these flaws.
What were the tools?
Strict accountability measures, rewards for ethical conduct, significant punishments for misconduct. Basically, tackling what we now call moral hazard.
Moral hazard.
Yeah, the risk that people act more in self-interest when they're insulated from the consequences. Kautilya countered it with oversight, reporting, but also psychological incentives, rewards for honesty, swift and severe consequences for cheating, all under constant scrutiny.
A sophisticated mix of checks and incentives. Okay, so how did people get into this civil service in the first place? What was recruitment like?
This is where that balance of trust and control really shows up. He knew the risks, but he also knew you had to empower officials to do their jobs.
Right.
So recruitment was all about merit, intelligence, capability, rigorous tests of knowledge, skills, suitability. Only the most competent should handle state affairs.
Competence over connections.
Absolutely. He wanted people who had the skills, but also understood the kingdom's bigger strategic goals.
But competence wasn't enough on its own, right? There was still the oversight.
Exactly. Meritocratic recruitment was paired with constant oversight, spies, audits, and that frequent rotation we mentioned, moving people around. It was like an early form of internal rotation.
And stop anyone getting too dug in.
Precisely. Reduce the risk of localized power bases, long-term corruption.
It sounds like his vision went beyond just administration. He saw the civil service as a pipeline for future leaders.
That's a very sharp observation. It's woven throughout the Arthashastra. Civil servants weren't just functionaries. They were potential stewards, future leaders in training.
Really? How so?
The regulations weren't just about managing bureaucracy. They were designed to cultivate character, competence, commitment to the public good. He was building institutional continuity, developing a class of people who could carry forward good governance, whoever was king.
So more than just an administrative arm.
Much more, a breeding ground for leadership. The emphasis wasn't just on technical skill, but on strategic thinking, ethical standards, public responsibility.
You said earlier, think like a king.
Yes. They were trained to understand statecraft, participate in policy, show moral clarity in crises. The ideal Kautilyan civil servant was being groomed to have the wisdom and responsibility of a ruler.
How did the training itself differ from, say, modern approaches?
It was much more holistic. Modern training often focuses on specific procedures, efficiency in narrow tasks. Kautilya emphasized intellectual and moral development.
What did that involve?
Intellectual training covered economics, military strategy, law, philosophy, the knowledge needed for statecraft. But equally important was emotional discipline.
Emotional discipline.
Controlling anger, pride, envy, lust for power, things he saw as clouding judgment. And moral grounding was paramount loyalty to the state above personal gain or ambition. It was about character formation.
So laws weren't enough, you needed inner discipline too.
He believed so. A resilient state needed not just external rules, but the internal virtue and wisdom of its administrators.
And the quality of this civil service reflected directly on the ruler.
Absolutely. Kautilya argued an intelligent king would know he needed capable ministers and administrators. So recruitment and development weren't just admin tasks, they were core responsibilities of the king.
The king had to be personally involved.
He advised rulers to scrutinize candidates, watch for vanity or greed, and reward honesty and initiative with trust and responsibility. A wise ruler shares power with competent, trustworthy people.
And advancement. How do people move up?
Purely meritocratic, ideally. Performance was key, measured by results, ethical conduct, even citizen satisfaction.
Not just seniority or connections.
No. Promotions were based on demonstrated skill, integrity, leadership potential. It fostered a dynamic system where excellence was rewarded, ethics were an asset, and rotation kept things flexible. The message was clear. You advance by serving the state, not yourself.
Lifting the state, not just climbing the ladder.
Precisely. And he also stressed independent judgment, ethical autonomy. He didn't want mere yes men.
He wanted them to think for themselves.
Yes, especially in complex situations where rules might be ambiguous or local context mattered. They were expected to mediate disputes, ensure justice, protect the vulnerable. That requires empathy, judgment, negotiation skills.
So they were guardians of order and fairness, not just implementers.
Exactly. Sometimes even a moral counterbalance to royal power.
It really seems like he had a very long-term view of the civil services role.
He definitely did. He saw civil servants as shapers of the social contract whose influence lasted beyond their time in office. An exemplary official was remembered not just for policies, but for cultivating peace, preventing crises like famine, mentoring younger officers. They carried the state's institutional memory, passing on wisdom, providing continuity.
Their legacy was meant to endure.
Yes. Wise administrators fostered peace, prevented crises, mentored the next generation. The civil service wasn't just bureaucracy. It was the civic soul of the state, the repository of expertise, built on competence, ethics, commitment, not just rules, but nation building through character and continuity.
A powerful vision. Okay, let's get into some specifics. How did he actually set this up? The recruitment, oversight.
Well, the foundation was methodical recruitment based purely on merit, no favoritism. One source mentions spies disguised as ascetics scouting for men of spirit, intelligence, and eloquence, actively seeking talent.
Proactive recruitment.
Exactly. Once hired, department heads were responsible for management, training, accountability. And the king himself was advised to monitor departments regularly.
The king personally checked on work, revenue spending.
Yes, down to that level of detail. It was meant to ensure efficiency and catch any problems early.
And the rotation of department heads was part of that oversight.
Crucial part. Frequent rotation prevented entrenched corruption, personal loyalties overriding state loyalty, complacency, kept allegiance focused on the king and the state, not personal gain.
Financial integrity seems like it was a massive concern for him.
Paramount. The Arthashastra spends a lot of time on strict oversight and checks, especially regarding finances. He knew financial misbehavior was a huge threat.
That quote about tracking birds versus tracking dishonest officials.
Yes. Possible to know the path of birds, but not the ways of government servants who hide their dishonest income. Cynical, but maybe realistic, given the stakes.
So what practical measures did he use for financial accountability?
Multi-layered checks. Officials collecting revenue had to keep meticulous accounts of income and spending. Any discrepancy triggered investigation, you had to explain it satisfactorily.
Or face penalties?
Yes, especially if negligence or corruption was suspected. Embezzlement. Taking more than you were entitled to that meant removal, possibly severe punishment.
And spies were used here too.
Specifically recommended for detecting financial misconduct. Were officials hoarding funds, misreporting revenue, manipulating systems,
And if caught?
stripped of their position, faced financial penalties to recover funds, and in severe cases, even death, depending on the scale of the crime.
The punishments generally sound incredibly strict. What was the legal framework?
It was strict, definitely intended as a deterrent. Serious crimes like major theft from the state or blatant corruption could lead to public humiliation, even death. The aim was deterrence as much as punishment.
Can you give some examples?
Embezzlement could mean confiscation of all personal property. Lesser misconduct negligence, minor mismanagement might result in fines or dismissal. But serious corruption, bribery, collusion, Kautilya even countenanced torture to extract confessions in those cases. And public humiliation was common for various lapses, being smeared with dung or ashes, paraded with broken pots, head shaved, visible signs of disgrace.
Very clear that integrity was non-negotiable. What about paying these officials? Salaries? Benefits?
Kautilya understood you needed fair compensation for an effective and fair service. He set up a graded salary system based on the state's finances and the demands of the job.
Was it always cash?
Not always.
Okay.
Compensation could be in kind land allotments, grain, livestock, or often a mix of cash and kind, provided some economic stability.
That's interesting. Did he consider their families?
Yes, quite thoughtfully. If a servant died on duty, their family, sons, wives would receive their salary and food allowance for a time. There was support for dependent children, elderly or sick relatives.
Great.
And on significant life events for families of deceased servants, funerals, births, illnesses, the state provided financial help and public honor, acknowledging their sacrifice.
It's incredibly comprehensive.
Yeah.
Recruitment, oversight, punishment, compensation, even family welfare. He seemed to cover everything.
He tried to. His regulations even tackled misuse of power, exploitation. He called out errant officials, those who wasted resources, were reckless financially, or exploited the public.
How did he propose dealing with them?
He recognized human tendencies toward extravagance or miserliness with public funds. Monitoring and accountability were meant to curb these. If misuse or exploitation was suspected, the king should investigate, often using spies.
And is found guilty of hoarding wealth or misappropriation.
Severe punishment, property confiscation, maybe even death for egregious abuse of power. He was relentless about financial integrity.
He even listed specific ways officials could cheat.
Yes, 40 ways of stealing, covering fraud against the treasury and exploitation of the public. Things like manipulating payment periods, falsifying work accounts, cheating on weights and measures, misreporting quality or price, fiddling with container sizes.
He really thought through the potential loopholes. How were investigations conducted?
Systematically. Anyone potentially involved, subordinates, storekeepers, accountants, advisors, assistants, would be interrogated individually. Lying during interrogation meant the same punishment as the accused. Collective responsibility for transparency.
What about victims?
After interrogations, a public proclamation invited victims to report losses. If they provided proof, they were compensated.
And the trial rules?
Strict. If accused of multiple frauds and found guilty of just one, you were liable for all charges. If accused of defrauding a large sum and fraud was proven for even part of it, you were liable for the whole amount.
Wow. What about informants? Were they protected? Rewarded?
Yes. Informants whose information led to conviction got a share of the recovered funds, typically 16th for an outsider, 112th for a state servant. Protections were offered too. They could remain anonymous or attribute the info elsewhere.
But false accusations were punished too.
Severely. Corporal punishment or fines if the case failed. If an informant withdrew a charge under duress from the accused, the informant faced death. A strong message against both corruption and false claims.
So high stakes all around, discouraging both crime and false witness.
Exactly. And the regulations detailed punishments for many specific administrative crimes: theft from the treasury, death by torture, theft of other property, punishment fitting the crime, misbehavior by judges or clerks, corruption by coin examiners, officials covering up merchant offenses, neglecting duties, mistreating workers, failing public safety, allowing theft of state property, cheating in gambling, harming protected animals, neglecting state animals.
The list goes on. Public humiliation, fines, dismissal, worse.
Yes, a very comprehensive and often severe system, all underlining the absolute importance Kautilya placed on integrity in public service.
Beyond punishment, how did he try to cultivate loyalty?
He believed true loyalty came from a mix of ethics, recognizing officials had a stake in the state's prosperity, and a just system that rewarded good service and punished betrayal. Merit-based recruitment was key here too. People felt appointed for ability, not favoritism.
And the internal surveillance helped reinforce that.
Yes, the spies monitoring conduct served as a preventive measure. The constant vigilance, even if unseen, reinforced ethical behavior because officials knew actions could have consequences.
Creating an environment where ethics were actively reinforced.
Exactly. The justice system itself supported this. Tiered penalties based on severity, intent, rank aimed for fairness and deterrence. But remember, prevention through system design was always the priority over just punishment.
And incentives mattered too. Morale boosters.
Definitely. Recognition for outstanding service rewards, promotions, privileges, these weren't bribes, but genuine morale boosters, reinforcing the value of dedicated ethical work.
Okay, and we touched on decentralization being balanced with accountability.
Yes. He allowed for local autonomy, recognizing the challenges of governing a diverse empire, but it was always coupled with strict central rules, frequent audits, centralized reporting, a balance between local responsiveness and central control.
Redundancy and cross-verification were also key principles for resilience.
Very much so. For critical tasks, especially financial ones, he wanted multiple layers of verification, independent record keepers, auditors, informants. Not to create bureaucracy, but to build resilience and integrity into the system, honest and operational even if one part failed.
It all comes back to designing a system robust enough to handle human flaws.
Precisely. A systemic design assuming flaws. An interlocking web of oversight, incentives, structure, defined duties, authority limits, surveillance, consequences for every role, division of authority to reduce collusion, parallel supervision for extra oversight.
And record-keeping underpinning it all.
Absolutely vital. For continuity, deterring arbitrary decisions, enabling audits, maintaining accountability.
So it wasn't just rules, but embedding ethics into the very culture and procedures.
Yes. Institutionalizing ethics. Training wasn't just policy, but moral reasoning. Integrating ethics into daily decisions.
And the system was designed to be resilient in crises, too.
Yes, preparedness was key. Emergency roles, rotational staffing, successor planning, building institutional continuity so the state could function despite shocks or leadership changes.
The espionage integrated within the administration. A complex element.
The internal audits by secret agents? Yes. Monitoring bribery, laziness, disloyalty. Kautilya felt direct supervision wasn't enough. This added an unseen layer of accountability, a deterrent.
So the civil service truly was a fundamental pillar of the state for him.
Absolutely. Alongside the king, army, treasury, without a trustworthy, efficient, ethical administration, laws couldn't be enforced, policies couldn't be implemented, the king's authority couldn't be maintained. It's a testament to his belief in systemic governance, guided by institutions, not just individuals.
It's an incredible blueprint. That example of Vishnugupta really brings it to life, doesn't it?
It does. It gives a practical snapshot. Vishnugupta, a revenue officer, gets an urgent task. Audit a grain merchant suspected of hoarding. Shows the need for vigilance, rapid response.
And his awareness of skies.
Right, spies are everywhere, underscores that pervasive internal oversight meant to deter misconduct.
And the consequences were clear.
Absolutely. He finds discrepancies, relies on Kautilya's code, he who robs the king shall be executed, shows the clear, severe penalties for harming the state.
Then he gets rewarded for doing his job well.
Yes, he files a thorough report, gets royal commendation, rewards, that's the performance-based recognition system, and finally, he expects to be rotated soon, reinforcing the policy against entrenched interests.
So the whole cycle is there. Duty, surveillance, consequences, rewards, rotation.
Exactly. The reflection sums it up. A system designed to preempt corruption, ensure fairness, embed vigilance. A moral and administrative philosophy, civil servants as warriors of order, guided by the Arthashastra.
Kautilya's vision.
Yeah.
It was so foundational, robust, regulated, ethical civil service. And his principles, though ancient, they still offer so many insights into governance challenges today, don't they? The need for accountability, ethics, systemic integrity.
It really makes you think about the parallels in our own world. How do modern institutions deal with the same issues Kautilya tackled? What parts of his system might still hold lessons for policymakers striving for efficient, ethical governance?
This deep dive really shows a surprisingly sophisticated, almost modern approach to building a stable state. It's a testament to well-designed systems and the crucial role of those people, often behind the scenes, who make the state function.
Indeed.
It seems less glamorous, maybe, but he saw it as totally crucial. Efficiency, accountability, loyalty within that group,
Mm-hmm.
he thought those were the bedrock of a stable state.
Exactly. The bureaucracy itself, not just the ruler, was foundational. That's quite a modern way of thinking, actually. It implies, that good governance needs strong institutions, not just a charismatic leader.
And it wasn't just about raw power, was it? The relationship between the ruler and these officials seems key.
Absolutely key. The texts really emphasize that. Even the most brilliant king, needed capable people to actually do things, to execute the vision.
So the civil servants were like the engine of the state.
Pretty much. Indispensable. And it wasn't just about blind obedience either. Kautilya seemed to understand that these officials needed to be invested. Shared purpose, shared success, that was vital for the whole thing to work long term.
Interesting. So more of a trust relationship based on achieving shared goals like prosperity, stability.
That's a good way to put it. A trust relationship aimed at the overall health of the kingdom. It wasn't just the king demanding things.
Okay, so you have this powerful, essential civil service. What kind of people did Kautilya think should lead it? What were the qualities he looked for?
Right. Well, the sources paint a picture of leaders, kings, top officials needing a mix of, sharp intellect and strong character. Wisdom and intelligence were huge.
Meaning, like knowing a lot.
Knowing a lot, yeah, but broadly. Statecraft, law, economics, military stuff, even ethics. A really wide knowledge base. And strategic thinking was especially prized.
Strategic thinking.
Yeah.
So seeing the big picture, anticipating problems.
Exactly. Not just reacting, but looking ahead. Navigating complex challenges, both internal and external. That ability to foresee danger was considered, essential for security and prosperity.
Wow, okay, so they needed to be a super smart, strategic, almost like governance experts. But it wasn't just about brains, right? You mentioned character.
Definitely not just brains. The texts also stress decisiveness, courage, making tough calls quickly when needed.
So no hesitating.
Pretty much. Leaders had to act. And sometimes, the sources say they needed to be ruthless. But, and this is important, it had to be balanced with compassion. And always, always within a framework of justice and fairness.
Oh, okay. So not just arbitrary cruelty. It had to serve a purpose, ideally justice.
Precisely. And that links to the next big quality, ethical integrity. It seems fundamental in Kautilya's system. Leaders had to operate by a strong moral code, treat everyone fairly.
It sounds like righteousness wasn't just nice to have, but a requirement,
Yeah.
a non-negotiable part of public service.
Absolutely. Kautilya seemed to recognize the danger of unchecked power. So integrity was like a built-in constraint, essential for the state's legitimacy, its stability.
Okay, that makes sense. Now, something else that really stands out is Kautilya's focus on information. Almost obsessive, it sounds like. Intelligence gathering?
Oh yeah, it's a core pillar. He saw accurate, timely information as the absolute lifeblood of the state. And the sheer scope of it is impressive.
How so? What kind of scope are we talking about?
Well, it wasn't just military intelligence, like finding out what enemies are doing. It was everything. Internal affairs, official conduct, public mood, economic performance.
Wait, so spies weren't just on the borders. They were inside the government, among the people.
Exactly, a whole network. Spies, informants.
Yeah.
The sources describe this system for keeping tabs on, pretty much everything and everyone. Officials, citizens, potential plots.
Why such intense focus? What was the goal?
Control, mainly. By controlling information, the ruler could anticipate threats, understand what people needed or were thinking, and basically maintain a firm grip. It was for external security and internal stability.
Proactive governing, almost. Like using intel to stay ahead of problems.
Yes, very much so. And not just stopping conspiracies, but also monitoring the economy, social trends, the overall health of the kingdom. It's like a very, very early form of data-driven policy.
So intelligence as a way to prevent crises before they even start.
That seems to be a key insight, yes. Identify potential issues early. Take action. Given how much he valued wisdom and strategy in leaders, it makes sense he'd want them to have the best possible information.
Right. Okay, this brings us to ethics again, because with all this power, all this information gathering, how did he keep things from going, completely off the rails?
That's the crucial question. And the sources suggest he had a surprisingly robust ethical framework built into the civil service precisely because of that power.
Robust how?
Well, there's a real emphasis on ethical rigor. He knew power corrupts, basically.
Yeah.
So integrity, accountability, these weren't afterthoughts. They were central to his vision of good governance.
And this is all laid out in the Arthashastra, his big text on statecraft.
Exactly. The Arthashastra doesn't just talk strategy, it lays down clear rules of conduct for officials, their duties to the state, and importantly, what happens if they mess up.
Specific rules, not just vague ideals.
Oh, very specific. A defined code and mechanisms to enforce it. Accountability was huge.
How did he ensure accountability?
Through things like regular audits, inspections, performance reviews. It's like an early version of checks and balances. Ways to make sure officials were actually doing their jobs properly and not abusing their power.
And the consequences sound serious. Rewards and punishment.
Very serious. The sources talk about big rewards for doing well and promotions, money, but also, yes, swift and severe penalties for corruption, negligence, betrayal, everything from getting demoted right up to execution.
Wow. So a strong deterrent effect was clearly intended.
Definitely. He seemed to believe you needed both the carrot and the stick. Positive reinforcement, but also the real fear of consequences to keep everyone in line and maintain those ethical standards.
But it wasn't just about avoiding punishment, was it? You mentioned officials also had a duty to the people.
Yes, that's another key piece. The sources highlight that. Officials weren't just serving the king, they were ultimately responsible for the public good. Prioritizing the people's needs was part of the job description.
So the state's legitimacy depended on serving the people well.
Exactly. Kautilya understood that. Officials were entrusted with the kingdom's welfare, and their actions had to reflect that responsibility.
Okay, let's shift gears slightly. The nuts and bolts. How was this whole administrative machine actually structured? The sources mention a layered system.
Yeah, it was deliberately designed that way. The key insight seems to be avoiding putting too much power in one place. So you have the king at the top, obviously, but then a network of skilled officials below him, each managing specific areas.
Specific areas, like departments.
Precisely. The sources mention clear divisions. Revenue, military, law enforcement, diplomacy, even intelligence had its own branch. It allowed for specialization. Surprisingly modern, really.
Yeah, it does sound quite organized. Specialization prevents overlap and boosts efficiency, I suppose.
Right, and these departments, while connected, apparently had a fair bit of autonomy. They could make decisions within their own areas without constantly running everything up the flagpole.
Interesting. Okay, and now for what seems like one of his most revolutionary ideas. Recruitment. Meritocracy.
Ah, yes. This is a big one. The sources really emphasize it. In a time when your family name usually determined your job, Kautilya was basically saying, nope, we want the best person, regardless of birth.
That must have been radical.
Hugely radical. He understood state effectiveness depended on competent officials. So skills, intelligence, ability, demonstrated ability, that's what mattered, not your family tree.
How did they demonstrate ability? Tests.
Seems so. The sources talk about objective tests, examinations, assessing technical knowledge, strategic thinking, loyalty, even integrity. Sounds like a pretty tough hiring process.
No kidding. And it didn't stop there, right? Performance reviews.
Yeah, regular evaluations to make sure people stayed competent and followed the rules. If you didn't measure up, you could be reassigned or even removed. Merit wasn't just about getting in, it was about staying effective.
So merit applied to getting the job, but what about moving up, especially into leadership roles?
Good question. While merit was the baseline, Kautilya knew leadership needed more. For high-ranking posts, ministers and such, there was rigorous testing of administrative skills and, again, that crucial moral integrity.
Leading by example seems important here.
Very. The sources stressed that leaders had to embody the virtues expected of everyone else. Wisdom, fairness, decisiveness. You couldn't just talk the talk.
And you mentioned something about rotating leaders.
Right. To stop anyone getting too powerful or entrenched in one spot, officials apparently didn't stay in top positions forever. It limited corruption potential and also created a more versatile, adaptable leadership group. People got experience in different areas.
Smart. Thinking ahead about power dynamics and this focus on competence.
Yeah.
It extended beyond just hiring, didn't it? ongoing training.
Absolutely. Kautilya saw governance as dynamic. You had to keep learning. The sources say officials were expected to continually develop their knowledge, political theory, military strategy, economics, ethical governance, lifelong learning, basically.
And not just the practical stuff.
Yeah.
Ethics training, too.
Yes, that was key. Reinforcing the moral dimension, preventing corruption, ensuring loyalty wasn't just to a person, but to the state's long-term vision. You needed the skills and the ethical compass.
Makes sense. A well-rounded public servant.
Mhm.
Okay, let's circle back quickly to those rewards and punishments. The sources give a bit more detail. It sounds like they weren't messing around.
No, definitely not. The system was designed for impact. We're talking lavish rewards for outstanding work, land grants, titles, big promotions, real incentives for excellence and loyalty.
And the flip side.
Equally impactful. Swift, severe consequences for misconduct. Demotion was one thing, but for serious offenses undermining the state corruption, treason. Yeah. Execution was on the table according to the sources, a very high-stakes environment.
So the severity was primarily a deterrent to protect the state's integrity.
That seems to be the main goal. Maintain the moral fabric, make the cost of corruption incredibly high, clear consequences were needed.
Okay, now let's really dive into this surveillance aspect. Your sources consistently frame it as fundamental, not just a tool, but a pillar of his system.
It really seems that way. A key insight is Kautilya's realism, maybe. He understood that even carefully chosen, well-trained officials are still human. They can be tempted, they can get lazy.
So surveillance was necessary to counter that. Watching the watchers, as the sources put it.
Exactly. Constant oversight was seen as essential to prevent corruption, inefficiency, misuse of power. You couldn't just trust everyone implicitly.
And it wasn't just the boss watching the subordinates, right? It sounds more complex.
Much more complex. A whole web. Internal reports, yes, but also peer review officials encouraged to monitor each other. And then that crucial external layer, spies and auditors, embedded within the system itself.
Multiple layers of oversight, like a precursor to modern internal audit departments or even transparency offices.
You could definitely see it that way. Relying on just one check wasn't enough. You needed internal, peer, and independent external views.
And there was a psychological angle, too. Not just fear, but incentives.
Right. It wasn't purely coercive. Rewards for integrity, land, status were part of it, but also the fear of public consequences. Punishments were apparently swift, transparent, and damaging to one's reputation. Both carrots and sticks again.
And rotating officials fits into this surveillance picture, too.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Moving people around prevented them from building little empires, getting too comfortable, or forming corrupt alliances. It kept things unpredictable, which was another psychological safeguard.
But despite all this watching, the goal was still justice. Equality before the law.
That was the stated aim, yes. The sources suggest the goal was proportional punishment, applied consistently. Even high officials weren't exempt, though maybe the king's scrutiny was handled more discreetly. Accountability for all was the principle.
Okay, let's just revisit that core idea of competence and merit one more time. The sources really hammer this home as the absolute bedrock.
Because it was the bedrock for Kautilya. He fundamentally believed that only competent people, skilled, smart, ethical, should have authority. It wasn't just a nice idea, it was the essential requirement for the state to function effectively.
And the structured training was key to building that competence.
Totally. The sources detail these programs covering law, economics, military stuff, diplomacy, but also ethics and practical problem solving. It was about creating officials who knew the theory and could handle real-world challenges.
With that ethical grounding being just as important as the technical skills?
Arguably more so in some ways, instilling that sense of duty, service over self-interest. And mentorship played a role too, didn't it? Experienced leaders guiding the newer ones.
Yes, that's mentioned. Passing on knowledge, values, best practices. Ensuring continuity and cultivating that culture of responsible leadership. And Kautilya recognized different types of leadership were needed, not one size fits all.
Right. Ministers, regional governors, military commanders, they needed different skills, different styles. He valued specialization to make the whole system more responsive.
And people worked their way up, gaining experience gradually.
Yeah, starting in lower roles, proving themselves, then advancing. It built practical insight, ensured stability. You understood the system because you'd worked within it at different levels.
And ultimately, public service was seen as character building, requiring integrity above all.
That seems to be the message. It wasn't just a job, it was a calling demanding moral integrity, prioritizing public welfare. That's how you foster loyalty and respect.
Okay, so just to reinforce that point on surveillance one last time, it really was the backbone, wasn't it? Critical for control, accountability.
Absolutely critical. Internal monitoring of officials, external monitoring of the public. Kautilya saw it as essential for maintaining order and ensuring accountability. Not just about fear, but about making sure the system worked as intended.
Which leads us back to the deep ethics of it all. With so much power concentrated, that ethical framework was non-negotiable.
Exactly. Kautilya knew power was dangerous. So, a strong ethical code was the necessary counterbalance. Proportional justice in rewards and punishments was part of that fairness, accountability.
And those key principles, again, were
Integrity, loyalty to the state, not just individuals, transparency, accountability, and always fairness and prioritizing the people's welfare. These were the ideals.
timeless ideals for good government, really.
They are. He knew without them, trust collapses, stability goes. And while punishments could be harsh, the goal wasn't cruelty, right? It was protecting the state, protecting the public trust. And appeals were possible.
That's an important point the sources make, yes. It wasn't arbitrary. There were mechanisms to appeal, suggesting a check on absolute power, even in punishment. Now, what about the ethics of the spies themselves? That seems like a tricky area.
It is tricky. The sources acknowledge the concerns, privacy, potential for abuse, but Kautilya viewed it pragmatically, it seems, a necessary tool to prevent bigger problems like mass corruption or rebellion.
A necessary evil, perhaps.
Possibly how he saw it, but crucially, the sources also suggest even the spies weren't above the system. They were also held accountable for their actions.
Okay, so bringing this all forward, it's amazing how relevant a lot of this still feels. The sources draw direct lines to modern politics.
It's quite striking, isn't it? Ethical leadership, accountability, using information. Okay, now it's data for policy, performance-based hiring. These are all hot topics today.
Yeah, think about modern government performance reviews, audits. It really echoes Kautilya's checks and balances.
Exactly. And his focus on accountability is mirrored in modern anti-corruption agencies, ombudsmen, things like that.
And the meritocracy idea, choosing leaders based on skill and giving them ethical training. We see that in public service recruitment and leadership development programs everywhere.
We do. A merit-based civil service, well-trained officials, clear rewards and consequences. These are still seen as pillars of good democratic governance in many places. Capability over birthright, continuous learning, accountability mechanisms, it all has echoes of Kautilya.
Even his spy networks. You could maybe see parallels in modern whistleblower protections, internal auditors, external auditors, the whole push for government transparency.
That's a good connection. While the methods are vastly different, that underlying principle of needing oversight, needing ways to ensure accountability, it's remarkably consistent.
So wrapping up this deep dive, Kautilya's statecraft gives us this incredibly detailed, surprisingly sophisticated model.
Yeah, the emphasis on a meritocratic ethical civil service, the vital role of intelligence, the absolute necessity of accountability and justice, and how relevant these principles still are.
It really offers these timeless lessons, doesn't it, about
Yeah.
balancing power with responsibility and what truly makes for stable, effective governance.
Absolutely. Foundational principles, really.
Okay, so that brings us to our final thought for you, the listener. Thinking about everything we've covered, which of Kautilya's principles strikes you as maybe the most challenging to apply today? Or perhaps the most vital?
Good question. Is it that tricky balance between security and liberty with modern surveillance? Or the constant debate about meritocracy versus other factors in choosing leaders?
Lots to think about there. We encourage you to mull that over.
Thanks for listening. We look forward to the next one.